Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 44. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, we ask the question, is evolution a god of the gaps? Today, we're going to begin by talking about what a god of the gaps is. Then we'll see how what I call Bay is a series of beliefs that really are all god of the gaps arguments, even though they're all atheistic. Then we'll look at micro versus macroevolution. We'll talk about intelligent design as an alternative to the macroevolutionary hypothesis and how it's not about gaps, even though evolution is. And then finally, we'll end with the choice. Do we trust in evolution, or even more broadly, B-A-E, which we'll talk about later, or do we trust in God? So that's what we're going to get to in today's pod. Let's start with the initial question. We initially said that evolution is potentially a god of the gaps. And if you've ever heard that phrase, it's generally discussed in the realm of people who are believers in God, people who are religious, and how they use God to fill in gaps in scientific understanding. We have to begin with this idea first, which is that science is incomplete. It's always going to be incomplete. There's always a process of learning more and more. And so when you think about the scientific endeavor, whatever realm or whatever area you work in, we're always learning more. We don't ever have it just all figured out and we know exactly how things work. My area is in robotics and artificial intelligence. And so when I think about those areas, we've learned a lot, but the more you learn, there's just so much more that you understand that you don't know. And so because science is always going to be incomplete, that also means that there are always going to be gaps in our understanding. There are always going to be things that we don't quite understand how it works. And that's to be expected. And so science helps us fill in some of those gaps, but it's not going to help us with everything. Now, what some people do who are believers is that they'll explain any gap in the understanding of the world that we currently have about a thing, often scientific in nature. They'll explain those gaps by simply saying God did it. Now, again, as someone who is a believer, I'm not necessarily saying that it's wrong to say that, but what I'm saying is that, of course, to look at everything and say that God did it, well, someone who is perhaps a believer in something other than the faith in Jesus Christ, which is my belief system, they could just as easily say something like that. So, for example, in the past, you would have had people that looked at lightning bolts from the sky and said Zeus or one of these lightning gods or thunder gods were the reason why there's lightning. Well, we know now scientifically that that's not the case, that it's not Zeus doing that. But people came up with those ideas because they said, hey, I don't understand how lightning works. And so I'm just going to simply say that the lightning god did it. And this is a problem because if we're really wanting to know what happens or what has happened in the world, then if we just simply make up things, this is what atheists are correctly going against, then how can any religious or theistic understanding of things be taken as viable? So atheists are rightly suspicious and opposed to God of the gaps reasoning, because often what happens is just like that in the case of Zeus, or if you think about ancient peoples that had various rituals related to getting it to rain or having their crops grow, and they would have these various gods that they would be worshiping, sometimes even sacrificing their children to be able to appease this god and get the crops to grow, to get rain to come when it was sorely wanted. Atheists rightly look at those and say, that's ridiculous. And that's not going to make crops grow, and it's not going to make rain come, and it's not going to make the sun shine, and it's not going to make lightning come or not come. And all of that is correct. So they're rightly opposed to this. And those who are believers in the truth in Jesus Christ should also be very suspicious and opposed to this kind of reasoning, where anytime there's a gap, there is an insertion of something miraculous or something that requires God to step in. Because it's, again, it would just be you making up that answer. Now, what I want to point out though is that while that's true that we should be opposed to God of the gaps reasoning, what happens is that often atheists only look at one side. And what I mean by this is they are only opposed to one extreme, the extreme of the religious gap filling. But they seem to be just fine as long as your gap filling is atheistic. And this is what I'm getting at in today's pod. You see, there's the other side of the spectrum is that scientism, which is the idea that science basically answers everything or answers everything that we can know. That's a belief system. And that's the other extreme. On one side, we know that there are gaps in understanding of science. And so some people will immediately fill them in with God did it, with no deliberation, with no thought, with no investigation at all. But the other side to this is that you have people that are completely against religion or anti-religious who are on the other side of the spectrum. And when there are gaps in scientific understanding, and we said at the outset, there always are going to be, when those gaps arise for the people on the other side of the spectrum, what they do is they allow for things that really sound very similar to the God of the gaps reasoning that they are opposed against when it's on the other side of the spectrum. You say, okay, Jerry, what do you mean that scientism can encourage God of the gaps reasoning? Well, on this side of the spectrum with scientism, often you'll see gaps in scientific understanding and knowledge filled in by saying, essentially, God cannot have done this. Now, when that happens, that is a faith statement, just like someone filling in the gap with God must have done this. On one side of the spectrum, that's the God of the gaps. But on the other side of the spectrum, when you say God cannot have done this, that's not a statement from science. That's a statement from scientism, where you believe that science is the only way to come up with a piece of knowledge, or where you think science answers everything. Of course, as we said at the outset, science can never answer everything. It's not going to fill in all of the gaps. So let me show you what this looks like. This brings us to, as we said before, that there are all kinds of anti-scientific possibilities that get seen as acceptable simply because they don't require a God. And so you'll see atheists seeing things as potentially acceptable that are ridiculous scientifically. But as long as they don't allow for a God to be in it, these people allow for these kinds of ridiculous ideas. I've got an idea for a podcast coming up soon where I talk about some of the things that you see, for example, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and how those things are atheistic in some ways, and how these ideas are often passed off as being scientific. And so it's a really interesting concept. And so we'll be getting to it in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. But let's go to the next section, because this idea of Bay as these three different, what I would call gods of the gaps, these things, as we just mentioned, are completely anti-scientific. They don't line up with known scientific laws, and yet people are fine with them in ways that they would never be fine with a believer saying something like this. But they're just fine with it simply because it doesn't require a God. So let's look at what I'm calling Bay. I like calling it Bay because, again, that's kind of a short. It's a slang term for baby or something like that. So if a guy's talking about his woman or a woman's talking about her God, they use the term Bay instead of baby. But Bay actually spells three of the atheistic gods of the gaps. So we see that matter exists in the world. We see that life exists in the world. And we see complex life forms like humans, for example. How did those come to exist? As we answer that question and really point out the three major atheistic ideas behind, maybe what I would say the three most popular atheistic ideas behind the emergence of these things, matter, life, and complex life forms, what you're going to see is that they are completely anti-scientific, but because they don't require a God, people at that other end of the spectrum are just fine inserting these gods of the gaps. So let's start with the first one. How did matter come to exist? Well, there are really only two viable hypotheses to examine. The first is that nothing produced it. Now, I know there are going to be people that say, well, Big Bang doesn't mean that there's nothing that produced everything. It's that there's a singularity, which is kind of like nothing, but it's not really nothing. Now, that just kicks the can down the road. Those of us who are believers are just going to simply ask you, okay, where did the singularity come from? And eventually you're going to go in this infinite regress to eventually you have to get to a place where there really was nothing, and then matter came to exist. That's really what we're talking about with the Big Bang. And so the scientists can come up with these ways to try to make it sound like it's not really nothing popping everything into existence. But that's practically what we're talking about here. So when we ask the question, how did matter come to exist? The first idea is that nothing produced it, aka the Big Bang hypothesis. I don't call it a theory. It doesn't qualify as a theory scientifically. And so we could talk about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory, but it doesn't qualify as a theory because it clearly opposes known scientific laws. Now, the alternative to this is that God created matter. And there really aren't any viable explanations besides those two. It's Big Bang, or it's a God who created everything, that made matter. Those are the two options. Nothing produced everything, or someone produced everything. This is what it boils down to. Now, the idea of matter popping into existence from nothing is as anti-scientific as you can think of. We know that matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed according to the first law of thermodynamics, for example. So when you say that nothing created the matter in the universe, you are literally saying something that is opposed to a known law of science, the law of thermodynamics. We could talk about something that's more logic-based, where we're talking about the idea of there being a cause for what we see. And so even if you think about the law of cause and effect, if the effect is that we see this matter, we see this universe in the world, then there needs to be an adequate cause. That is, it's difficult because this is such, you understand the concept of cause and effect as early as probably 4 or 5 years old. So when I'm having to explain a concept that everybody lives by, which is any effect has to have an adequate cause. To say that nothing produced the matter of the universe is literally going against that basic idea, and it rails against anything that we understand of the world. And yet people want to call that a theory. It's a hypothesis at best, and not a very good one. How did life come to exist? Secondly, well, there are two hypotheses to think about. One is what we would call abiogenesis, the idea that life arose from non-life. Now, the problem here, once again, as we saw with the first thing, with Big Bang, is that the idea of abiogenesis is opposed to the law of biogenesis. Now, the law of biogenesis says that life arises from life, not from non-life. So the law of biogenesis literally opposes the idea of abiogenesis. And yet you see many very smart people who are willing to accept the possibility of abiogenesis. Why? Because it doesn't require a God. Because the alternative hypothesis here would be that God produced life. So you see, either you have someone living that produced life, which actually lines up with the law of biogenesis, or you can say that life arose from non-life, which is opposed to the scientific law of biogenesis. Which one do you go with? Well, if you're going with science, you can't go with abiogenesis. Third, how did the diversity of life come to exist? Well, once again, there are two hypotheses to examine. First is that there is a tree of life. This is what evolution would say, that there's this tree of life, and we've really only observed the tips of the branches of this tree. But by faith, we believe that there is all of those tips of the branches emerged from a trunk that we have no direct observation of, but there was a single ancestor of all of the life forms that we see today. And you just simply believe that all life is derived from that trunk, that single ancestor. Now, the alternative is that life is not a tree. The diversity we see is not so much that there is a single tree, but that there's a forest, and that there are many life forms that were initially created. And from those life forms came more diversity. And that whoever made that life at the beginning put adaptability to produce the kind of diversity that we currently see. Now that's the alternative. According to Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, and God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. The biblical model of creation is that God made many different kinds of life forms and put in them the ability to adapt to their environment. So that the thing that Darwin called natural selection is something that God made, that he allowed for nature to adapt. I don't like the term natural selection, by the way, because natural selection inherently gives some kind of agency to nature. Nature doesn't have agency. Nature doesn't select. Now, I know, again, what Darwin meant by it, but again, when you talk about all of these things, you have to speak of them in terms of agency, or they don't make sense. When you talk about evolution, doing things, well, evolution is not a person or an agent to do things. So when Dawkins refers to evolution as the blind watchmaker, well, again, none of it makes sense when you see the purpose in things, when you see the purpose in different bodies of various life forms, you see that purpose. It doesn't make sense to say that there was a purposeless process called evolution that came upon the purpose that we see in these various organisms. And we'll talk more about that later, but this is the idea. When you say something like natural selection, you introduce this idea of agency to nature or to evolution. But if you truly believe in those ideas of macroevolution, there's no agency there. It just happens. And it happens upon just this really useful way of coming up with life, or diverse and complex life. So which one is it? Is it a tree of life, where we really only see the tops of these branches of this tree, but we must just simply believe that it all initially came from a trunk? Or do we see actually just a bunch of trees in a forest, and that those trees were initially planted in again by a creator, and that's how they came to exist? You've got two options, really. You can believe in Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, or you can believe in God. Now we'll talk about the alternative of God in a second. But notice that for all three of these ideas, Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution, all three of them are built on gaps. The gap from nothing to matter. The gap from non-life to life. The gap from simplicity and simple single-celled organisms, let's say, to the complexity of something like the human body. All three of those ideas are built on gaps. And in each one of the cases, there is no observable evidence that anything has ever bridged that gap. So there's no evidence that anything has ever popped into existence from nothing. There is no evidence that there was ever anything living that popped into existence from non-life. And there's no evidence that things go from simple to complex. In fact, it is the opposite. The second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, you might call it, says that things go from complex to less complex, or to more simple. Over time, things tend towards disorder, not towards order. But evolution says no, things get more orderly, things get better over time, things improve over time. That is not what we see in the universe. So all three of these ideas are anti-scientific. They go against what we observe in nature and in science. Why are they accepted by so many who would call themselves scientists and researchers? Because these people are on the other side of that spectrum. Oh, they're just fine with telling the religious person not to bring God into every little gap that they find. But they go to the opposite extreme and say that there's never a religious or theistic explanation for anything, and you must not ever use a theistic explanation. And so therefore, you can have these really ridiculous explanations as long as they're anti-theistic or atheistic. And this is the other end of that spectrum. These are gods of the gaps. Nothing to matter, non-life to life, simple to complex. These are gaps, and they are filled in with Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. But you have to just believe them. And when you don't believe them, watch and see how people get angry. Watch and see how people are so opposed to you because you're going against their religion and their gods of the gaps. So you can trust in God and look at the story. A creator of matter, life, and adaptable life forms versus these gods of gaps that everything about those ideas opposes what we know in science. So what we are proposing, what we continue to propose, is that there is an eternal living creator who made matter and life with complexity and adaptability. So when we talk about microevolution versus macro, that really brings us to what we're getting to next, which is this idea of adaptability that we see is something that God built into the different kinds of life forms that he made. He built them to be able to adapt to their environment. But to take that adaptability and then say that, well, everything just came from one thing is ridiculous. So that brings us to the idea of micro versus macroevolution. I want to start with this, and that is that no one disagrees with the basic observation that Darwin had, which was that we can see small changes among species. Nobody disagrees with that. There aren't any believers that are disagreeing with that. Anybody who's ever seen dogs bred or see various types of fruit, we all can see that there are changes in species. The fundamental issue is to see changes among species or see changes among even genera. Believe that's the plural of genus. That doesn't mean that an apple turned into an insect, or an insect turned into an elephant, or an elephant turned into a human. These are the kinds of ideas that macroevolution is propagating. These are anti-scientific ideas. Small changes in a species are not the same as these large-scale changes. And what often happens is I'll come across this argument of where people will take microevolution, which no one disputes, and use it as evidence of macro. And they just simply extrapolate. And it's ridiculous to extrapolate in that way. One example I like to use is I have a 6-year-old nephew, and he can write. So he can write letters, and he can write his name, and he can write sentences. He wrote a letter to one of my sisters that got him some Legos. And if you look at that letter and you look at the fact that he can write words, and then let's say you take my book, I Walk, Therefore I Am, and you say, Jerry didn't write that book. His nephew wrote that book. And your evidence that my nephew wrote the book instead of me is that you saw him write a letter and he used let's say he used all of the letters of the alphabet. So therefore, if he used all of the letters of the alphabet, why is it a stretch to think that he could have written this book that is attributed to me? This is what people do when they jump from micro to macroevolution. But the thing about it is, it's way worse than that. Because to look at microevolution and to scale that up to say that an ant eventually turned into an elephant or a dog or a human is the kind of thing that these people are saying. And they simply say, well, if there's enough time, then that could happen. But that's anti-scientific. to use these small changes is God of the gaps reasoning. This is what's so interesting to me when I see, and I think I'm probably going to write a book about this, but it's so interesting to see people try to use this idea of God of the gaps, and what they don't realize is that they are just simply on the other end of the spectrum of the God of the gaps reasoning, right? Because God of the gaps ultimately is on the extremes. Where we are in the middle is to say, yes, science can help us understand some things, and yet there are also some things that we can attribute to a divine designer. But what happens is, on one end of the spectrum, people don't want to look at science at all. And if there's anything that science isn't answering right now, they just put God in there. But the other end of the spectrum is potentially worse, because these people are saying science answers everything, and they're willing to look at things that they would claim are science, but they are completely anti-scientific just because they don't include God or require God in their explanation. And so this is God of the gaps reasoning, to look at the gaps that we see in the diversity of life and extrapolate in the way that these people are claiming could have happened or should have happened or must have happened. Okay. You say, Jerry, what do you mean by it's extrapolating? Well, we've already mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. Evolution opposes the second law of thermodynamics. Again, the idea is that things tend toward disorder. Things tend toward towards going from a high energy state to a low energy state. So when you're thinking about thermodynamics, when you think about the idea of, for example, if you take a hot cup of tea and you place it on a table, is it going to remain hot? Is it going to get hotter? Or is it going to cool to the temperature of the surroundings? So cool to room temperature. Well, we all know the answer to that. On the flip side of that, let's say you take a glass of ice water in the same room, so the same environment. Is that ice water going to decrease in temperature and get colder? Is it going to remain the same? Or is it going to warm itself to get to the warmth of the room, to get to the room temperature? And we know the answer to that. It's the latter. That's entropy, that you're going from a higher energy state in terms of the hot coffee to a lower energy state. In the case of the ice water, you're going from a lower energy state because it's colder to a higher energy state. But all of this is going in such a way that everything goes towards equilibrium. And so because of that, what you don't have, though, is you don't have a hot cup of coffee or a hot cup of tea in a room that's 70 degrees. And then without an energy source, the cup gets hotter and hotter and hotter. Likewise, you don't have a cup of ice water and that ice water gets colder and colder and colder, even though the temperature of the room is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is this idea of this idea of entropy, where things tend towards equilibrium. Things really tend towards, you might even say, disorder. But again, we're talking about essentially a lower energy state where there aren't differences between. So again, that difference of the hot cup in the room temperature and the difference between the cold cup in room temperature, entropy seeks to have everything be at equilibrium. And so evolution opposes this idea by saying, okay, you have these simple life forms, you've got equilibrium, and somehow things just start becoming more complex. Things, and they do so with no energy being added to the system. You see, we understand that the only way that hot cup in a room temperature room gets hotter is that there's an energy source somewhere and someone is adding energy to that system of the cup. We understand that. Likewise, if that cold cup of water gets colder, it is because someone is actively taking heat away from that cold cup of water in the middle of a room that is 70 degrees all around. So there's something that's happening. Something deliberate is happening to make those things occur. But in the case of evolution, we're told, no, nothing deliberate's happening. But essentially a cold cup of water in a room temperature room is getting colder, and a hot cup of tea in a room temperature room is getting hotter. There's no energy being added. It's just happening that way. This is what we are saying when we say that evolution opposes entropy. It goes against just the basic idea of how things work. So since the universe tends from order to disorder, from complex to simple, from hot to, let's say, equilibrium, or from cold to equilibrium, evolution claims the opposite, that somehow these things just happen to go against the grain, to go against what the tendency of the universe is. That's what evolution is claiming. But on the other hand, if we just get down to the practical part of it, when it comes to evolution, species transmutation does not exist. I want to repeat that. What do you mean by species transmutation, Jerry? I'm simply saying to you, one species doesn't just turn into another. One kind of thing doesn't turn into another kind of thing. So you don't have ants turning into elephants and elephants turning into humans. It does not occur. It does not exist. It is a God of the gaps. It is a belief in something that you can't show any evidence for. So I ask you, those of you who are watching, I often have a lot of atheists watching. It's very simple. Give me one example of one kind or family of organism producing a different kind. Now, the issue is you cannot do such a thing. And there are plenty of videos that show professors at various universities who are atheists who claim that this is what has happened. And someone just simply has a microphone and they take the microphone and they say to them, hey, can you give me one example of this? And then there's this pause. And there's this realization that you can't give one observable, verifiable example of this. And this is what's so interesting about it. This is why it is a God of the gaps argument, because you believe so firmly in it with no evidence, with no observation that can point to it. Now, you might say, well, what about the fossil record? No, the fossil record does not even show a high number of transitional forms. Now, what I mean by that is, I would argue it doesn't have any transitional forms, not in the kinds that people are saying. So yes, there are transitions between, again, these small changes in species, sure. But the idea of an ant turning into an elephant or any of those kinds of things, where there are these changes from one kind of thing into another kind of thing, there just are no transitional forms in that way. And I had someone one time just go to Wikipedia and like give me a long list of so-called transitional forms. And I started with the first one and I looked at it and it was not a transitional form. And this is what I get a little irritated at, because people make these claims and they say it so forcefully that sometimes believers get to a place where you get on your back foot and you think that maybe they have a point, but there is no point. These transitional forms aren't there. But let me, for the sake of argument, concede that potentially there are some transitional forms that exist. Even if I were to concede that to the atheist, the issue that you have is that if everything that we observe came from a single ancestor, then that means that the kind of macroevolutionary processes that you're talking about had to happen so many times that there should be transitional forms all over the place. And by the admission of any atheistic evolutionary biologist, that is not the case. It is one of the fatal flaws to Darwin's work, and he mentioned it himself in On the Origin of Species. By the way, if you argue for this evolution stuff and you haven't read Darwin, maybe you say, well, Darwin's outdated. Okay, sure. But the fundamental idea is the same as what he had. And so maybe you have what you would call more evidence now, but it's really the same arguments as Darwin made. And Darwin astutely understood that this was fatal to what he thought was a theory. And what he essentially said was, we'll find them one day. Now, this was back in the 1860s. This is now 2025. And that multitude of transitional forms that Darwin expected to be found has not materialized. And the fact that it has not is fatal. Because again, everything that we see, if this macroevolutionary story is true, there should be transitional forms that are so abundant that it just would be it's very difficult to quantify it, because everything would have had everything would have had these transitional forms, and yet they don't. They don't exist. And they certainly, even if you want to argue take that list from Wikipedia and say that those things are transitional forms, it's not nearly enough to warrant the statement that everything came from a single ancestor. This is one of my favorite shortcomings of this evolutionary hypothesis, and that is that the necessary series of selective pressures that would lead to the kinds of things. Let me just speak from the perspective of going from an ape to a human. In order to go from an ape to a human, there are so many things that would have to change in that ape to get to the human. And not only would all of those things so many things have to change, but all of these intermediate versions of this ape turning into a human would need to be better versions of the initial ape in terms of being more adapted to its natural surroundings. And yet, no one ever attempts even to offer, okay, this is what this version 1 would be, and let's say there are 20 versions between the ape and the human. What often happens is they'll show you basically 2 versions. An ape kind of getting on its hind legs, and then an ape acting like it's walking, and then you have a man. Now, the thing about it is all of these intermediate ape man type, again, it's hard. They're basically characters, because you don't find they're unobserved in the fossil record. These are complete fabrications. These are things that people come up with, but they're not found in the fossil record. You don't have some half ape, half man transitional form in the fossil record. It does not exist. And so, but we need more than just that. What we would need is a series of pressures. Why should an ape go from being quadrupedal, 4-legged, to being bipedal, for instance? What are the series of pressures that would cause something like that to happen? No one even tries to offer a series of pressures. They generally will give you one, maybe a combination of 2 or 3. They never give a series of pressures, because to do so is simply pure conjecture. And that's what all this evolutionary stuff is. It's a story that you tell. And it's a story that has no basis in the fossil record. And again, in the case of the second idea, there are no selective pressures that are given. Then finally, mutations and natural selection, which is supposed to be the mechanism for making this happen, is a completely inadequate mechanism for producing the diversity that we see in life. Mutations are breaking the genetic code. So the idea that you break genetic code to get something to work better is, as someone who writes code, is a ridiculous idea. The idea that you break code and make things work better just does not happen. It does not work. And so when we see the intricacy of the code that God has put in, when we look at something like DNA, and it's clearly a code, the idea that you can break that you can make a bunch of errors in it, and it will produce something better, is again a faith statement. It is a God of the gaps argument. But it's not, mutations with natural selection is not an adequate mechanism for producing the evolution that they say happened. Okay. Now, just to finish this point, microevolution is observed. Macroevolution isn't. It is a belief system that is based on gaps. And if you didn't have those gaps, then you wouldn't really have, again, you wouldn't be able to have that belief system at all. And I think that it's, again, it requires the gaps to be able to have it exist. And this is, rather than looking at everything as a forest of life, when you look at a tree of life, you have all these gaps. So the story that fills in the gaps is macroevolution. It is the God of the gaps. So again, when I say a gap here, I'm saying that there's this story, that there's a tree of life. Now, all we observe are the tops of the branches, but the trunk of it and everything leading to those tops of the branches that we can actually observe in the fossil record, all of that is said to be done via macroevolution. It's a God of the gaps argument, but it's fine, because as long as there's no God that's going to require you to live a certain way, then people are fine with it. As long as there's no religion involved, people are fine with it. Okay. This brings us to our last main point here for today, and that is that intelligent design is actually not about gaps at all. And this is one of the things that is really interesting when people uh, try to invoke the God of the gaps fallacy, is what it's often called. And again, there are people that use fallacious reasoning when it comes to God of the gaps. So if you are someone who is a believer and you see something and there is a gap in our scientific knowledge, and you simply fill in that with God and try to say, well, let's fill in this gap with God for the unbeliever or for the atheist. Yes, that's one extreme where you don't even really look at the science at all. You just say God did it about everything and don't acknowledge any science. But the other side, where everything must be scientific, or scientistic would be the better term, because many of these things are anti-scientific. So to call Big Bang science, to call abiogenesis science, to call evolution science is just the opposite of what we see in science. And that's why we try to point this out. Intelligent design and arguments from the design inference approach, these are actually not about gaps at all. They actually are arguing from positive evidence. Now, unlike these others, where we essentially say, hey, there was nothing and then there was matter. How do we explain that? Big Bang. We'll use that to fill in the gap. We look and say, hey, there was non-life, then there was life. How do we explain that? Well, abiogenesis. We'll fill in the blank. Well, we see all of this complex life, but it had to have all started from something very, very simple. How do we explain that jump? We'll fill in evolution. That'll fill in the gap. This is where these gaps are being filled in. What I'm saying to you is, intelligent design is not a God of the gaps argument. When you observe aspects of design in something, you're actually observing something. It's not a gap. You are observing complexity, organization, purpose. You observe these things, and then you make a conclusion or an inference based on what you have observed. When you see purpose, when you see complexity, organization, we're going to talk about a couple of other design features in a few moments. You're arguing from a positive place. I see these things. This is designed. And therefore, if it is designed, designs are made by designers. This is a positive argument. If I see evidence of design, then there must have been a designer. This is so again, think about this for a second. This is not God of the gaps. God of the gaps is to say, hey, we don't know how this works, or we don't know what this is, and so insert God. What we're simply saying is, no, we see design here. And so the explanation is that there was a designer. Now, as we just mentioned, design needs a designer. Like if you see a design, the idea that it just came about randomly, it came about with no purpose behind it, it came about with no thought, it came about with no intended energy directed, that's just ridiculous. We know that anything that has been designed had a designer. We know this. This is what we observe in our general experience. So, the famous William Paley thought experiment, this came from the early 1800s. So this thought experiment is nearly 200 years old. But let's say you're walking in the forest and you encounter a watch, one of those old-time pocket watches. And it's out there, you got ferns out there, you got grass, you got mushrooms out in the forest, you got trees out there, but you come across a pocket watch. And let's say you've never seen a pocket watch before. Question: if you've never seen a pocket watch before and you come upon a pocket watch in the forest, do you think for 1 second that you would somehow look at that and say, huh, that must have grown up from the ground? It just happened to be here. Of course not. You would look at that. You might not even know what numbers are. You might not be able to read time, but you'd look at that thing and you'd say, that isn't something that just came about on the earth. Somebody made that thing. I don't know how they made it. I don't know what it stands for. I don't know what it means, but somebody made that thing because you're observing that it has these parts. It's organized in a certain way. You might not know what the purpose is. It's a complex object, but when you put all of those things together, you know design when you see it. Now, one of the things I would argue is much of what's in that forest, those ferns, those mushrooms, the trees, many of those things are actually far more complex and amazing than that pocket watch. And yet, what we'll do, when I say we, those of us in modern times, will look at the pocket watch and be completely enamored by it. And we won't be enamored by the sun coming through the trees, by the tree itself, by the ferns, by the mushrooms, by the animals in the forest, which are far more complex than that pocket watch. And so we're arguing from the lesser to the greater. This is an a fortiori argument. If you're familiar with logic, a fortiori, so a, kind of like a priori, but a fortiori. We're arguing from the lesser to the greater. We're really arguing that if that little pocket watch has been designed, then if I see something that has more purpose, that has a greater purpose, let's say, that has more complexity, that is better organized, then I have to argue from the lesser to the greater. If this smaller thing, if this very impressive smaller thing was designed, then surely this more complex thing has been designed as well. So we see design in the world. It's evident. There are things far more impressive than that watch that have been designed in the world. And you think about something like biomimicry, which is a form of design of things. You could say it's engineering design. It's an aspect or an area of engineering design, but it's really more than just that. You can apply biomimicry to more things than just simply engineering design. But the idea of biomimicry is that you look at things in nature, things in life, and you learn from them. So the Old Testament says, go to the ant, you sluggard. It essentially says that as a human, if you're a lazy person, look at the way ants work. Consider the way those ants work. And then is there something that you could potentially learn from that? Now, similarly, I think speaking of ants, I did some work in the past with something called ant colony optimization. It's a computer algorithm where there is an attempt to use how ants and colonies work together to do optimization methods in computer algorithms, and that's biomimicry. There's something in artificial intelligence called a neural network. Much of what we do in AI is based on neural networks. The full term is an artificial neural network because we as humans have physical neural networks. We actually have real neural networks. The ones that we use in AI are artificial. They aren't. They're these math structures that really pale in comparison to the neural networks we see in humans. But what happened is they were inspired. The artificial neural networks were inspired by neural networks that we see in human beings. This is all biomimicry. If we look at these designs and we create these feeble imitations of what we see in the world, and we say our feeble imitation is of course designed, then how does one explain the more impressive designs that we see? Do we explain that by saying it just happened? Mother Nature? Well, over enough time, evolution just produced it? Again, when you say evolution produced it, you have to use that agency, which is, again, a misnomer. Evolution doesn't produce anything. Evolution is microevolution. The evolution we observe is simply a process where adaptability that has been built into life forms makes them somewhat better for their environment. Again, not necessarily better overall or better in some kind of absolute optimized way, but better in the local sense for their environment. Now, let me give you some examples here. You look at computer code. I write a lot of stuff in Python. If I write my Python code and I compared that to DNA, it pales in comparison. It's not nearly as complex. It's not nearly as just in all ways. Me writing some code in Python is recognized by all as being written by someone with a brain, someone who did so deliberately. But then we look at the code in DNA and what it does and how amazing it is. And there are people that essentially say that random processes are what produced DNA. But what Jerry wrote, that was just written. That was written. DNA, not so much. For mechanical engineering, that's my background. You take a water pump or an air pump. Well, that's been invented. Then you take the human heart, which is a marvel of mechanical engineering in terms of its size, in terms of how much it's able to pump, how resilient it is. Well, that just mutated to become that, right? Mutations and natural selection are what produced the human heart. But that water pump, that again is impressive, that was invented. But the human heart, that's just a product of mutation. Then you take my area, which is humanoid robotics, and you take a humanoid robot, and we've got one that we're working on, and hey, clearly designed. A lot of work goes into that and has gone into it and will go into it. And so you look at any of these, you look at, the Optimus at Tesla, or you look at some of the work by Figure, Digit, produced by Agility Robotics. I don't want to go down the line. Boston Dynamics has amazing stuff. All of those things have been designed, and quite impressively. They all pale in comparison to the human body. And again, they are imitations of the human body. But notice, we're arguing from the lesser to the greater, and then saying that the greater has not been designed is what people are trying to say. Those who are opposed to any kind of theistic explanation of anything are throwing out a viable explanation. We're saying that the humanoid robot was designed, but the human body wasn't. It just evolved. And it's again, if you could create a robot that did 50% of what a human could do, you take into account things like self-healing. If you could produce that, it would be worth millions, if not billions of dollars. And so, and I'm not saying do exactly what a human could do. I'm saying do part, and it would be worth that. We understand. And yet we look at our bodies and we somehow say, well, that just evolved that way. No, that's not what happened. It was made. If that code was written, so is DNA. If that pump was invented, so is the human heart. And if that humanoid robot has been designed, so is the human body. That's the way to think of this logically, and to think of this without bias. But if you're at the other end of that spectrum that we've been talking about, then yeah, you are biased, and you should really rethink it. Let me give you a couple of examples of ways that we see design, for example, in the human body. Designers make redundant systems. Now, what that means is designers want to make systems that if one thing goes wrong in it, that the system doesn't completely break down. So let me give you an example from balancing in humans. We have several things that go into how we balance. Our vision is a big part of that. The bones in our inner ear are part of that. Our ability to feel the floor with our feet, that's a big part of it. And so there are several aspects to balance that if any one of them goes wrong, you don't necessarily just immediately fall down. So for example, you could get a little dizzy based on your inner ear issues. But as long as your vision is clear, as long as you can feel the ground with your feet, you have these other aspects that allow you to balance. The human body is full of redundancies in it. just like this, so that if one thing goes wrong, you don't automatically just completely fall apart. Designers do that. Designers make redundant systems, and yet we see redundancies all in the human body. What are we to conclude? Are we to conclude that we can't put God there because that's God of the gaps? No, on the contrary, we're looking and seeing positive aspects of design and concluding that a designer must have done it. That's not a gap. That is based on the evidence. Now, evolution, that's based on saying that things went from simple to more complex. There's a huge gap, and evolution is there to fill it in. The other thing is learning. Learning in human beings is one of the most amazing aspects of design that there is. Every healthy human learns to walk on two legs, which is an inherently unstable behavior. Every healthy human learns to do it. By definition, if you're unable to do it, you're unhealthy. But the idea that that learning process is 100% in healthy humans is one of the most amazing things about the human body that God made. We all learn in our own unique way how to balance and walk on two legs if we're healthy. The idea of improving over time via experience, via various feedback loops, that is designed. You can't get to that in a random way. Like that, it's just not possible. And so as someone who, my PhD dissertation was about building learning systems for humanoid robots to learn balance and stability. And it's hard. It is a difficult problem. And we're getting better at that kind of thing. And it's interesting in some of the more recent work that's been done since I finished. And yet it's still hard. And all kinds of deliberation has to go into it. It doesn't just happen randomly, is my point. And even if we get to a place where it's easier and easier for us to teach our robots to balance and stabilize themselves, it will still not be the result of something that was not random. It will not be the result of something that was random. It will always be that someone had to design that system for learning. So, if we conclude that God designed these things, that's a logical conclusion, right? That's not from gaps. That's arguing from what you see positively in those various systems, like the human heart, like DNA, like the human body. That's arguing from positive. That's not arguing from gaps. So, in conclusion, do we trust Bay or God? As we review what we've talked about today, Bay is my acronym for this God of the gaps belief system that says that there was nothing and then matter arose. There was non-life and then life arose. There were simple life forms and they became more complex over time. That's Bay. That's the God of the gaps belief system. And you see the gaps here. Now, the alternative to that is belief in God. And one of the things we've pointed out today is that belief in God is actually not God of the gaps. There are some people who believe in God and they go to the extreme of God of the gaps, but belief in God is not inherently God of the gaps. What we're saying is that God made matter. He produced life with complexity and adaptability. We see that from the positive evidence, not from gaps. So that's it for today's show. Like I said, I've got an idea in the works where we'll look at some things from science fiction and show how evolution is really the basis of many of these science fiction ideas. And that means that evolution itself is science fiction as well. So I'm really, that might be next week. I'm not for sure, but that's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.